Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Unwelcome Access Podcast. As always, I'm Ross Edelstein, your host, and just as a heads up, for those who are watching on the day of release, the next couple will probably be short, including this one. I had a dental issue, and that is getting in the way of my ability to do things more generally. That being said, this episode is on language. Now, on the screen, and all of the photos I have in here generally will be from this same very recent trip I took. But we have a view from the dome car of a steam locomotive, which has steam and smoke rising up from the front of the train, with several silver stainless steel cars in between, going in between some just starting to bud trees with a blue sky and puffy clouds above. Now, this episode is going to be on language, and in particular describing disability. This is a topic that is both extremely important, far less important in the ways that people make it out to be, and a lot easier than people make it out to be. That being said, let's go ahead and get into it with our usual starting segment, Storytime with Ross. Now, the photo here is my usual Storytime with Ross photo, which is me driving a locomotive, looking absolutely angry, but having the time of my life. Now, the story I want to tell here is more or less the first time I was on a podcast. Now, I was invited to speak on a podcast by a group out of Chicago. I will link that podcast in the description here with another autistic person. And the podcast was essentially about language, about the same topic. And I was brought on as the person first language enjoyer. Now, if you don't know what that is, we'll be getting into that. But the reason I bring this up is that now I primarily use identity first language. This isn't a huge story, but the reason I bring it up is that I was on that podcast in about 2021. My views on language have changed, and the way that we approach language has changed. And that's one of the big things to remember with all of this. Language is not a monolith, it isn't set in stone. That being said, with that out of the way, let's get into more of that. Now, the image here is from that same train in a dome car. The car is empty with some bright blue seats with the logo of the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad, with the dome up above with panels of glass allowing you to see the blue sky and a large concrete bridge rising over Cuyahoga Valley National Park. Language is how we communicate. It is one of the few things that is human nature. Humans will find a way to communicate with some form of language. Now, in this case, we're mostly talking about words and how we use those words. But language can also be verbal or nonverbal. And again, here we're focused on the words. It also does matter, but not in the way you think. And when I say that, most people think that there is a right or wrong way to refer to something in a universal sense. For example, calling a dog a cat is explicitly wrong, right? A dog might exhibit cat-like behaviors, but it's not a cat. The thing is that most things are not that cut and dry, let's say. So usually people think that, oh, if I say the wrong thing, I'm going to instantly offend somebody and make them feel horrible. The reality is, especially when we're talking about disability and language, most people just want you not to be a dick. This is essentially the do not be a dick episode. And really, whether or not you get it right perfectly, most people are not going to treat you like you're a horrible human being because you didn't refer to them the way that you that they wanted on that first time. That said, the don't be a dick is also not making an effort to adjust the way you communicate once you know somebody's preferences. We'll come back to this. I have a product that I'm launching at the end of this, and it is the best price, free. But that being said, the first thing I want to talk about is the Stop the Slur campaign. Now, the Stop the Slur campaign is a result of the R word. You all know what the R word is. It started as a medical term. It comes from Latin and then Italian, and basically means to slow down, which is why often you'll see slow used as a replacement, which also in that usage becomes a slur. The use of medical terms as slurs is not uncommon. The big one is cripple, which has been in a lot of cases reclaimed by folks with physical disabilities. But the R word is sort of the most egregious the R word is the most egregious example of it, right? It is the one that everybody recognizes as that is a definitive slur in a way that most others aren't, and the community that it was applied to has no intent to reclaim it. That being said, it refers to what we now call intellectual disability. And that is the important thing to remember with the use of the R word, is that the campaign to end its use by not just the average person using it as a slur, but the medical community to sort of take away that power of association was led by folks with intellectual disabilities. This is, in fact, one of the few campaigns around intellectual disability that was entirely led, powered by, pushed to the core by folks with intellectual disabilities, not primarily by allies. Now, there were a lot of allies that were a part of it. But in most cases, folks with intellectual disabilities are treated as not being able to advocate for themselves. This is one of the reasons why the R word became more than just the medical, or more than primarily a medical. In a lot of cases, it became a slur. Because people were generally not in a place where they were given the, how do I put this? The self-efficacy, the same respect as others to defend themselves until, as it turns out, getting together, organizing, and developing a community strategy got rid of the R word essentially. It is now not something that can be put in government documents, for example. It's fallen out of favor rather in the medical community. And again, it's the big win that folks with intellectual disabilities have had when advocating for themselves. Using the R word has unfortunately come back with the second Trump administration. If you see somebody using it, please call them out. Legitimately, this is one of the most regressive and most backwards things that has come out of it. Because essentially, this has decided that, something that someone has no control over, much like other slurs like race, that has essentially become a accepted insult and adds into the wonderful high-level systemic ableism of the Trump administration. That being said, I do want to talk about the thing that's come out of it. Now, one of the things about language is that language has niches. There is a need to be able to express various things, and even if a phrasing falls out of favor, something needs to take its place. For example, the idea of Riz. It replaces the idea of somebody having charisma, having that sort of, how do I phrase this? It replaces that whole idea of charisma, of the ability to talk to other people and get them to follow your point of view, or however you want to have somebody using that charisma. It's a change in language, and it filled the niche of the longer word that it's based off of. Things like cool or rad or whatever, that fills that same niche of, hey, that's something that's awesome, which is another word that fills that niche. Something has to fill a spot to describe something, right? We're humans, we still need to describe things. And so that's where person-first language comes from. Now, on the screen, we have a Alco FA from the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad, sort of going past a crowd. And that's just a general photo I decided to put in there. That being said, person-first language is a result of the Stop the Slur campaign. Again, you need to put something in that niche. And one of the big things with the R word and other disability slurs, the idea is to strip somebody of their personhood, right? Especially when you're talking about something that is very medicalized. The medical model looks at you as a statistic in most cases. Even with and go back to any of the other episodes I've talked about where I give the building with steps and no ramp example, the medical model says, well, why should we have to do this for a very small number of the population, and ignores the individual's need to get in. The R word and slurs are intended to dehumanize. And the idea behind person-first language is to put that humanity first. And this was an idea of, again, folks with intellectual disabilities in particular. So some examples: person with a disability, person with autism, person who uses a wheelchair, etc., etc. Here's the issue. That idea of, hey, let's put that person before their disability and make them more than just their disability has been broadly imposed. And when I say imposed, I mean imposed. The idea was this is going to now be the baseline of what is acceptable. And this has kind of backfired in a lot of ways. Folks with disabilities of all sorts have a broad variety of ways they want to refer to themselves. And there have been a number of times that I, as a disabled person, have had a non-disabled person act like I was the devil for wanting to use identity first language, which we'll talk about when we get to the next slide. That being said, that imposition has led to a lot of issues in the opposite direction, right? Where you have ableism that comes about because you're not listening to what people are saying. That being said, I'm going to go ahead and call this our halfway point and throw it over to our mid-roll. Wow, Future Ross, what a great ad. Or maybe there isn't one. As always, our primary sponsor is you, the viewer, over on patreon.com/unwelcomeaccess. However, this space is intentionally left open for disabled people who have a project, a business, something they want to get out there to help platform people who might not otherwise get a chance to share in this sort of format. That said, back to your regular programming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the episode. All right, so we only have a couple of slides left, but now I want to talk about identity first language. Now, this is another scene from Cuyahoga Valley National Park with me hanging out of the locomotive, or not the locomotive, the train car I was in, getting a photo of the smoke sort of rising up into the side over the spring starting to bloom landscape of the valley. Now, identity first language does what it says on the tin, right? You put the identity first when you're talking about the disability. So, for example, a disabled person, a blind person, a deaf person, an autistic person. This doesn't sound like a huge difference, right? But for the groups that really prefer it, it is a big thing. And especially, this is sort of the first time I'm going to talk about this, but it will probably have its own episode, the deaf community. Now, the deaf community has been identifying as the deaf community, capital D deaf, I want to be clear, for a long time. And part of why I say capital D deaf is there's a difference between deaf capital D, which is participation in deaf culture, knowing American Sign Language or other sign languages, etc., and being deaf, which is the condition of not being able to hear. The deaf community, capital D, is sort of the biggest user of identity first language, at least the broader group does this. It's not as common if you are lowercase d deaf and just have the condition of not being able to hear. But the deaf community has sign language. It has full-on culture festivals. The Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City has a deaf culture festival, which is well renowned for being a way for mainstream art museums and museums in general to provide that community a chance to be highlighted in the same way as everyone else. Deaf slam poetry is a thing, done in American Sign Language. Again, this is a community where that is a huge part of the identity. And so the identity to them is not something that erases their humanity. And so they put the identity first. The same goes with a lot of autistic people. Now, autism is not as cut and dry, but more and more people, especially folks with lower support needs, including myself, prefer to address autism as a part of their identity. It is something that is a part of who we are. It is a part of why we are the way we are at our core. It's not something that really can be changed. In the same way that being from a certain city or state or country is something that is not a part of your identity, right? And broad level disability advocates often use identity first language. This also includes folks who, for example, have reclaimed the term cripple. That is a whole area of study called crip theory, for example. That being said, this is growing in popularity, which is often to the chagrin of others, right? Folks who are not disabled look at the change in language and you end up throwing your hands in the air, or you see the one person who does go over the top about not being called the right thing, and it makes everybody who has a preference, one way or the other, look wild. And the reality is, the choice of language and how you refer to somebody is the basic not be a dick thing, right? calling somebody the way that they do not prefer to be described is as bad as calling someone by the wrong pronouns, especially if they're a trans person, by calling somebody just a name they don't prefer. Like, for example, if you're named after your father and your father was a horrible person and you don't want to be associated with them, calling somebody that name ends up being a dick move. So that's why I've created, and I will have this up on Patreon and in some point on my website, what I like to call the Ultimate Disability Language Guide. Now, I'm not charging anything for this, but I wanted to create a sort of poster handout that people can give out, and it has basically this information. So the first question is, do I need to bring up someone's disability? And usually on this flowchart, the answer will be no. Let me give an example. Let's say you're at a museum. Somebody is asking, hey, which way to the gallery? They are in a wheelchair. You don't necessarily need to say the wheelchair accessible way to the gallery is this way. You can just say the way to the gallery is this way, or the easiest way to the gallery is down the hall and up the elevator. You don't need to explicitly say this is where people who use wheelchairs, people like you, have to go. Most of the time, you do not need to bring it up. And that is one of the key things, right? Language is how you other. It's part of the reason why the R slur was so prevalent and so used as a way to denigrate people, and especially denigrate folks who had it assigned as a medical term. Because there was this need to say, well, you're just R slur, your opinion doesn't matter. That said, there are times you need to bring up someone's disability. And for those times, when you have to answer yes on this flowchart, the question is, do I know the person's preference? So even then, a lot of the time, you don't have to bring it up. That being said, if you don't know, I generally say stick to person-first language. We'll come back to this. But if the answer is yes, ask yourself, okay, if I know the person's preference, what is their preference? Use that, whether it's identity or person first. But if it's no, and you use person-first language, that's usually where it's going to end. Because in most cases, if you don't know somebody and don't know their preference on how to describe their disability, you are probably not going to have it come up again. Going back to that museum gallery example, let's say you're the interpreter, the person who's out there spreading the museum's knowledge, right? I don't know what that noise was that I just ended up making. I will never be able to make that again. But in that interpreter role, if somebody says, hey, do you have anything that I can engage with? And they're somebody who's blind. If you say, yeah, we have something that people who are blind can do, let me guide you to it, or however you want to go about it, right? Most of the time, that's not going to be something that has to come up again, even when you're getting them a specific program or whatever. Most of the time, even if they prefer to be called a blind person, they don't feel like there's a need to correct you because the interaction is fleeting. That being said, I do have a bit trailing off of that, which is, was I corrected? In that same example, that blind person might say, hey, I prefer person who is blind. If that's the case, just follow what they say. Don't make a big stink about it. Just correct yourself next time and make the actual effort. At the end of the day, that is what people are looking for you to do. They aren't looking for you to be right 100% of the time, every time, right off the bat. Because disabled people are a broad group. There is no unity, especially when you're talking about 25% of the population. There's no right or wrong answer. That being said, here's the bottom line. And on the screen, I have nickel plate 765 from the same event, throwing up lots of smoke and steam coming through with a yellow piece of cord acting as a line in the image. But tis with my visual gag. Anyway, the bottom line is listen to disabled people and people in general. Call people what they want to be called. If somebody corrects you, it's fine. Don't assume that that's what everybody wants to be called. People with disabilities are not a monolith. Person first is a good baseline, right? It is what is accepted generally as this is fine, this is accepted. But as a baseline, it's not the only line. I can't believe I have to say this, but for the love of God, don't say slurs. Please don't use slurs when referring to disabled people. And if somebody says, hey, that is kind of a slur, or hey, that is not a good way to refer to people with disabilities, stop using that language. Things like differently abled or other sort of cutesy terms like that. Don't use those either, because at the end of the day, those are not what people with disabilities are looking to be called. And they are much like applying person-first language to all disabilities, an imposition of non-disabled people on disabled people. Just let disabled people set the way we want to be called, just like anybody else. Again, this has been a shorter episode, but this is also very important. Thank you all for watching, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. A huge shout out to the wonderful people over on Patreon who are helping to make this project happen. As always, we aren't getting any ad revenue from YouTube, and you'll also get your name up on the screen right about now, like these lovely people who have helped support the podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to our next episode. Unwelcome Access is a production of Autism, a disability and accessibility consulting organization.